My name is Lucas Hargrove, and my father left me nothing but debt, a broken name, and a warehouse full of rust. Not metaphorically, an actual warehouse, on the edge of an actual town, filled with actual rust. 32,000 square feet of abandoned manufacturing equipment that hadn't moved since 1997, a property tax bill that had been accumulating interest for 11 years, and a deed with my name on it that his lawyer handed me at a reading where every other person in the room got something real. My uncle got the house. My aunt got the investment accounts. My two cousins got the vehicles, the jewelry, the vacation property. I got the warehouse. My father's last message to me, delivered through a man in a suit in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, was a building full of things nobody wanted on land that had been forgotten. I was 26 years old. I had $42 in my checking account. And I had a deed. What nobody in that conference room knew, what none of them could have predicted, was what I was going to do with it. And when I built something extraordinary from nothing, my family came back. Not to apologize, not to celebrate, to take it. Before I take you into what happened, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if stories about people who start with ruins and build empires, and then have to protect everything they built from the people who abandoned them first, mean something to you. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read them all. Every single one. Now let me take you all the way back to the beginning, because this story starts long before the warehouse. My father's name was Gerald Hargrove. He was a man who understood how to look wealthy better than he understood how to be wealthy. He had a gift for it. The right car for each year, the right watch for each room, the right story for each crowd. He moved through the world projecting a version of himself that was about a decade ahead of his actual financial reality. And he did it with such consistent conviction that most people believed it completely. I believed it for the first 12 years of my life. Then I found a stack of final notices in the kitchen drawer when I was looking for a pen. Then I found 3 maxed out credit cards in a jacket pocket when my mother asked me to take his dry cleaning in. Then I started to understand what the gaps between his performances actually contained. My mother knew. She had known for years. She had the particular weariness of someone who has been managing a gap between the story and the reality for so long that the management has become its own full-time job. She didn't talk about it directly. She expressed it in small, economical ways. Coupons she cut from newspapers, grocery store brands she switched to when she thought no one would notice. The careful way she answered questions from my father's family at holiday gatherings that confirmed everything without confirming anything. My father's family, his brother Raymond, his sisters Deb and Carol, Raymond's wife Sandra, they were not poor people. Raymond had done well in commercial real estate. Deb had married into money. Carol had built a catering business that had grown into something real. They were the kind of family that gathered at the holidays with a specific unconscious performance of prosperity. The right wine, the right gifts, the new car mentioned once and not again, because mentioning it once was enough. My father was the cautionary tale at those gatherings, not stated, understood. He was the charming one who couldn't quite land it. The one whose ventures never quite materialized. The restaurant that opened and closed. The import business that was going to transform everything and didn't. The real estate deal that was always 3 months from closing. I watched my father at those family gatherings. I watched him perform his confidence for his siblings, for their spouses, for the children who orbited around the adults like small planets. I watched him work the room with his laugh and his stories and his absolute unwillingness to be seen as less than. And then I watched him in the car on the way home. Quiet, staring at the road. The performance packed away until the next time it was needed. He was not a bad man. I want to say that clearly and mean it. He was not cruel. He was not violent. He loved me, in the imprecise and impractical way of someone who has never learned to translate love into the daily actions that demonstrate it. He showed up for the big moments, graduations, birthdays, and was frequently absent for the small ones that add up to the texture of a childhood. He died when I was 24. Suddenly, a heart attack on a Wednesday morning, alone in the parking lot of a grocery store. The grocery store where he'd gone to buy milk, an errand so ordinary it had no business being the last thing. I was at work when my mother called. I drove to the hospital, though I already knew, by the way her voice sounded, that driving fast didn't matter. I stood at his bedside. He looked smaller than I remembered. He had always seemed, even in the difficult years, somehow larger than the room he was in. Like the performance had given him physical mass. Without it, he was just a man. Just my father. Gone. The will reading came 3 weeks later. I drove to the lawyer's office on a gray November morning with my mother in the passenger seat. She had asked me to come, though the lawyer had already told her gently that her name was not in the will. She and my father had been separated for 4 years. The marriage intact on paper and dissolved in practice, in the way of people who have been disappointed in each other for too long to formally close the chapter. The conference room had a long table and 7 chairs, and everyone who mattered to my father's estate sat in them. Raymond, Sandra, Deb, Carol, their children, my cousins Tyler and Megan, who I knew the way you know the people you've grown up being put next to at holiday tables. Familiar without being close. And then me, and my mother, who sat beside me as a witness rather than a beneficiary. The lawyer's name was Ferguson. Gray suit, reading glasses, the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered unexpected news to enough families to develop a delivery system that felt like anesthesia. He went through the assets. The house, which I had not grown up in, which my father had purchased with Raymond's financial backing in a complicated arrangement that I had never fully understood, went to Raymond. The documentation, Ferguson explained, reflected an existing co-ownership structure that entitled Raymond to full possession upon Gerald's death. The investment accounts, which I had not known existed, which turned out to be modest but real, went to Deb, listed as beneficiary on the accounts themselves, a designation that superseded the will. The vehicles went to Carol's son Tyler, the jewelry, such as it was, to Megan. A vacation timeshare that had been losing value for a decade went to Carol. Then Ferguson looked at me. To his son, Lucas Hargrove, he read, Gerald bequeaths the commercial property located at 1147 Industrial Drive, registered under Hargrove Holdings, LLC, along with all liabilities and encumbrances attached to said property. He read the address. He described the property. A manufacturing warehouse, previously used for equipment storage, closed since 1997. Current assessed value, $212,000. Outstanding property tax liability with accumulated interest, approximately $41,000. Pending municipal compliance notices, 3. Everyone in the room looked at me. Not with malice, not with triumph. With something more uncomfortable than either. Pity. My cousin Tyler made a sound that he converted into a cough before it became a laugh, but I heard what it was. My mother's hand found mine under the table. Are there any questions? Ferguson asked. I have a question, Raymond said. He had the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in boardrooms, commanding without effort. Is there any liquid asset not yet mentioned? Ferguson reviewed the file. There is a personal checking account with a balance of approximately $3,000, which will be applied against outstanding personal debts. There is no remainder. Raymond nodded once. He looked at me. Something in his expression was not quite readable. Hard break, he said. 2 words. Not unkind exactly, just efficient. The assessment of a practical man who had no room in his calculations for sentiment about someone else's inheritance. I thanked Ferguson. I drove my mother home. I did not go back to my apartment. I drove to Industrial Drive. I wanted to see what my father had left me. The warehouse was at the end of a road that felt like it had given up. The buildings on either side were abandoned or intermittent. A tire shop that appeared to be open on only some days. A storage facility with a fence that had lost a section. A vacant lot where something had once stood and been removed without ceremony. 1147 was the last address on the left. The building was large. Undeniably large. I had not understood the square footage until I stood in front of it. Gray corrugated walls, a sagging gutter along the roofline, a loading dock with 2 bays that had been sealed years ago, with a combination of sheet metal and wishful thinking. A chain-link fence around the perimeter with a padlock on the gate. The key to the padlock was on the ring Ferguson had given me. I stood at the gate in the November gray, and I held the key. I opened the lock. I walked in. Inside the warehouse was exactly what had been described and somehow worse to actually experience. Industrial shelving systems, partly collapsed. Manufacturing machinery whose purpose I couldn't identify, all of it filmed with years of rust and dust. A concrete floor that had cracked and heaved in patterns that suggested drainage problems. High windows, some cracked, some missing panes and replaced with plywood. The smell was metal and time. I walked the length of the building slowly. I was 24 years old. I had $42. My father had left me this, and I stood in the middle of it, in the specific quiet of an enormous abandoned space. And I made a decision. Not a detailed plan. Not a business strategy. Just a decision. I was not going to let this be the end of the story. I didn't know yet what the story was going to be. I just knew it wasn't going to end with me standing in the ruins of what my father couldn't build, giving up. I walked back to the gate. I locked it behind me. I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I started writing things down. What I'm about to tell you covers 6 years. I am not going to rush through them because the 6 years are the point. The 6 years are what makes everything that came after both possible and meaningful. But I will tell you the essential shape of them. I was working, at 24, as a project coordinator at a construction supply company. I had a salary that covered rent, groceries, and not much else. I had a degree in business administration that I had paid for myself through a combination of loans, part-time work, and a scholarship I had applied for during what was probably the most motivated summer of my life. I had also, in the 3 years since graduation, been teaching myself real estate law in the evenings. Not in a formal program. I couldn't afford formal. I was watching YouTube lectures from actual law professors. I was reading the textbooks available at the public library. I was taking notes in a series of composition notebooks that filled a shelf above my desk. I did this because I had watched my father fail at real estate his entire life, and I had come to believe, by the time I was 22, that his failures were not bad luck, but bad knowledge. That he had moved in spaces he didn't understand well enough, made deals with people whose leverage he hadn't analyzed, agreed to structures whose implications he hadn't read carefully. I was going to understand those spaces. Whether I ever used the knowledge or not, I was going to understand them. The warehouse became the thing I used it on. I started with the compliance notices. 3 of them from the municipality citing building code violations that needed to be addressed within 6 months, or the property faced forced remediation, meaning the city would do the work and charge me for it at a premium. I called the municipal office, I made appointments, I showed up in person, and I was unfailingly polite and prepared, which turned out to matter enormously, because most of the people who received those notices were either absent or hostile, and someone who showed up informed and cooperative was so unusual that the compliance officer, a woman named Patricia, gave me more time and guidance than I would have gotten any other way. Over the next 8 months, I addressed every compliance issue personally. I learned basic electrical. I learned what I didn't know, and hired the minimum necessary to fill those gaps. I did the physical labor myself, cleaning, clearing, patching, painting, on evenings and weekends. The rust on the machinery I addressed methodically, not because I thought the machinery was salvageable, but because I needed to understand what I had. Most of it was scrap, but some of it, a series of large industrial lathes, some precision measuring equipment, was old enough and well made enough that it had value to a specific kind of buyer. I spent 3 months researching the vintage industrial equipment market. Then, I sold everything. Not all at once, piece by piece, to buyers I found through patience and research. Some went to industrial museums. Some went to hobbyist machinists. Some went to a film production company that used old equipment as set dressing. The total I collected was $62,000 over 14 months. I used $41,000 to clear the tax liability and compliance costs. I kept $21,000. And I had a warehouse. Clean, empty, compliant, with good bones. I need to tell you about the man who changed the direction of everything. His name was Desmond Park. He was 61, Korean-American, and he ran a small commercial real estate development company that he had built from scratch over 30 years in a city where most of the money and most of the attention went to the luxury residential market. Desmond worked in industrial and mixed use. He worked in the neighborhoods that other developers overlooked because the margins were less obvious. He was, I would come to understand, one of the best real estate developers in the region. He was just not famous for it, because famous wasn't what he was building toward. I cold emailed him. I want you to understand the audacity of that. I was 26 years old, unknown, with no track record and no credentials beyond a business degree and a warehouse I had personally cleaned. And I wrote a cold email to Desmond Park explaining that I had a commercial property in a location I had analyzed to have specific potential that was not yet reflected in its assessed value, and I wondered if he might have 15 minutes. He didn't respond to the first email. He responded to the third. "You've sent 3 emails," he wrote. "Most people give up after 1. Come in on Thursday at 9. I came in at 9. I had prepared a presentation, printed and bound, because I had learned from all those hours of watching and reading and absorbing that the difference between someone who is taken seriously and someone who isn't is often just the evidence of preparation. Desmond looked at my presentation for about 4 minutes. Then he looked at me. "How old are you?" he said. 26, I said. "Who taught you to read a location analysis like this?" he said. "Public library and the internet," I said, "and a lot of composition notebooks." He was quiet for a moment. "The property is yours?" he said. "Inherited it at 24, I said. "From my father." "What did you inherit besides the property?" $42 and a story I decided not to repeat, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "Here's what I see when I look at this," he said. He turned the presentation back toward me and pointed to the location analysis page. "You're right that the area is undervalued. You're right that the zoning variance you're identifying creates specific opportunity. Where you're wrong is in your timeline. You've assumed a 2-year development arc, but this neighborhood's inflection point is more like 4 to 5 years based on municipal investment patterns." He paused. "If you can hold for that long without monetizing, the return profile is substantially better than what you've projected." "I can hold," I said. "How?" he said. "You have $21,000 in a building." "I'll figure it out," I said. "I always have." He looked at me for another long moment. "Come back in 2 weeks," he said. "I want to show you something." Desmond Park became my mentor, not in the formal, program-structured way, in the way it actually works, which is that he was willing to let me be in proximity to what he did, to ask questions and watch and absorb, in exchange for work that he could use. I became, for the first 18 months of our relationship, essentially an unpaid research analyst for his development projects, while keeping my day job. I produced location analyses, zoning research, market comparatives. I made mistakes, and he corrected them with the precision of someone who had made the same mistakes himself 25 years earlier, and had no patience for making them twice. I learned more in those 18 months than I had learned in 4 years of undergraduate education. What I learned about the warehouse was this. It sat at the edge of what Desmond identified as a pre-transition zone, an area that city investment patterns suggested would experience significant commercial and mixed-use development pressure within the next 5 years. The warehouse itself, properly developed, could become something. The question was what? Desmond helped me understand the options. The zoning allowed for a range of uses: light industrial, commercial, mixed use with variance. The building's bones, the concrete structure, the ceiling height, the loading dock infrastructure were assets in a market where industrial and creative space was in increasing demand from businesses that couldn't afford the premium districts. We developed a plan. Not together as partners, Desmond was clear about the distinction. and I respected it. He was my teacher and my advisor. The warehouse was mine. What I built with it was going to be mine. I converted the warehouse, not all at once, not in the way that flipping shows make it look. Over 32 months, with contractors I learned to vet carefully and negotiate with precisely, with a design I had worked out with an architect Desmond referred me to, who charged me half his rate because Desmond asked him to, I converted 1147 Industrial Drive from an abandoned manufacturing facility into 11 commercial units of varying sizes. A combination of light industrial workshop spaces and commercial studio units designed for the kind of small creative and craft businesses that were proliferating in the city and struggling to find affordable, well-designed space. I funded this through a combination of what I had: a construction loan that took me 4 iterations to structure in a way a bank would approve, and a portion of my salary from the construction supply job that I held on to for 3 years longer than I wanted to, because the income was a line of stability I couldn't afford to lose. The development cost me, in total, $814,000. I opened the doors on a Thursday in September, 4 years after my father's will reading. By the end of the first month, 9 of 11 units were leased. By the end of the third month, all 11 were leased, and I had a wait list. By the end of the first full operating year, the property was generating net income that was more than 3 times my construction supply salary. I gave my notice on a Friday. My manager shook my hand. I drove to 1147 Industrial Drive. I stood in the center of the building, which was now clean and well lit and full of the sound and energy of people working on things they believed in, and I let myself feel for one quiet moment what it felt like to have built something from nothing, from rust, from $42, from a father who left me ruins. And then I went to work on the next one. The next 3 years were the years of building. I don't want to flatten them into a montage because the details matter. Each project had its own specific challenges, its own specific learning, its own specific moment where I had to decide whether the obstacle was a stop sign or a detour. The second property was a former auto body shop, small, in a neighborhood that was further along the transition curve than the warehouse district. I purchased it with the equity from the warehouse as leverage, converted it to a mixed-use ground-floor commercial, and 2 apartment units above. The third was a corner commercial building that I partnered on with Desmond, my first real partnership, carefully structured with his guidance, with clear documentation of each party's contribution and rights. That one taught me more about the business side of development than any single other experience. By year 3 of the building phase, I had a portfolio of 5 properties. Net worth in the asset base, across all of them, was approaching $4 million. By year 5, the year I turned 33, the portfolio had grown to 9 properties. The warehouse had been refinanced, and the equity extracted was funding new acquisitions. 2 of the properties had been sold, and the proceeds reinvested. The company I had formed, Hargrove Development, registered as an LLC in the same county where my father's failed ventures had been registered and dissolved, was a real operating business with 2 employees and revenue that required an actual accounting system. I want to tell you what my life looked like in those years. Not glamorous, not the performance of success that I had watched my father attempt. I lived in a modest apartment for the first 4 years. I drove the same car I'd had since 22. I wore the same work boots until they fell apart and bought the same style replacement. I reinvested everything. Every dollar the portfolio generated that wasn't required for operating costs or loan service went back into the next acquisition or the next improvement. I did not buy things to signal that I was doing well. I was doing well, and the evidence was in the assets and in the bank statements, and that was enough for me. Desmond asked me once, in the 5th year, why I didn't give myself more. Because I'm not done building yet, I said. He looked at me with the expression he had when he was deciding something. You're going to be okay, he said. I've been watching for 30 years, and you're going to be okay. Coming from Desmond Park, that sentence was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I called my mother that night and told her. she cried. The good kind. My family found out. Not all at once, but in the way that information travels through family networks. Through the cousin who runs into the mutual acquaintance. Through the aunt who searches your name and finds the business registration. Through the uncle who has contacts in commercial real estate, who mentions your name in a different context than he expected. They found out that the warehouse had become something. They found out that the something had become several things. They found out that the name Hargrove Development was appearing in contexts that were not about failure, and they came back. Raymond called first. He called on a Tuesday evening, which told me this wasn't casual. Raymond did not make personal calls in the evening unless the call mattered enough to come outside business hours. Lucas, he said. I've been hearing good things. Raymond, I said. The development work, he said. Sounds like you've built something interesting. I have, I said. Your father would be proud, he said. I held the phone. I thought about my father's empty checking account and the rust on the machinery and my $42. Thank you, I said. I'd love to catch up, Raymond said. It's been too long. The family should reconnect. Sure, I said. We made a plan for dinner. I hung up. And I felt, with the same precision that I had once applied to reading financial patterns at a Sunday dinner table, that something was coming. The family dinners resumed. Not because I was naive. Because I wanted to understand what they wanted before they told me. Raymond hosted the first one. His house, the house that had been my father's, that he had taken cleanly at the will reading, was large and well maintained in the way of someone who understood property. He had put money into it over the years, and it showed. I came with my mother, who had more courage than anyone gave her credit for. Dinner was warm. Surface warm. The wine was good. The food was catered. The conversation was the kind of reconnecting after too long conversation that performs fondness without requiring it. Raymond talked about his own projects. He was careful. He was always careful. Not to ask directly about mine. But he asked adjacent questions. How the neighborhood was developing. What I thought about certain zoning trends. What the market was doing in the industrial and mixed-use corridor. He was, I recognized, doing exactly what I had done in the early years. Gathering information. Building a picture. I answered his questions with information that was accurate but not complete. Deb and Carol were at that dinner too. Deb was warm in the performative way of someone making an effort they find slightly inconvenient. Carol was warmer, more genuine, I thought, or at least more practiced at genuine. Her catering business had weathered some difficult years, and there was something in her that the difficulty had humbled in a way Raymond's success hadn't. Tyler and Megan were there. Tyler was the one who had almost laughed at the will reading. He was 31 now and had the specific quality of someone who has been comfortable his whole life, and considers that comfort a reflection of merit rather than circumstance. He asked me about the development work with the barely concealed condescension of someone who expects to be impressed and is slightly annoyed to actually be impressed. Megan was different. She was quiet at that dinner. She asked good questions when she spoke, which wasn't often. She had the eyes of someone who was watching more carefully than she let on. I noted this about Megan and filed it. After dinner, as I was helping carry plates to the kitchen, a reflex from years of making myself useful in spaces where I was uncertain of my welcome, Raymond appeared beside me. He was quiet for a moment. I want to be honest with you, he said. Please, I said. When your father died, I felt guilty about the will, he said. The way the assets were distributed. I want you to know that. I looked at my uncle. Did you feel guilty enough to say something at the time? I asked. A pause. No, he said. Okay, I said. Thank you for saying it now. He looked at me. Your father and I had arrangements that went back a long time, he said. The house, the investment accounts, those were tied up in agreements between us that predated the will. It wasn't as simple as it might have looked. I understand, I said. I wonder, he said carefully, if there's an opportunity for the family to work together. In what you're building, given the history, given that some of the foundation of what became available to you came from. Raymond, I said. He stopped. Let's have that conversation with everyone present, I said. If that's the direction you're heading, I want to hear it directly and clearly with everyone who might be part of it. He looked at me for a moment. Of course, he said. That makes sense. I drove home. I called Desmond. They want something, I said. Of course they do, he said. What are you going to do? I'm going to find out exactly what they want before I respond to any of it, I said. And I'm going to have everything I need before the conversation happens. What do you need? He said. A lawyer, I said. A good one. And time. Her name was Attorney Renata Collins. She had been practicing business and estate law for 22 years. She had the specific quality of someone who had spent 2 decades watching families do what families did to each other when money was involved, and who had long since moved past being surprised by any of it. I went to her with everything: the will, the deed transfer documentation, the development history, the current corporate structure of Hargrove Development. The conversations with Raymond, documented in notes I had written immediately after each one. She reviewed everything with the methodical attention of someone who was being paid to find the hole before it became a wound. Tell me what you think they want, she said. Raymond is talking about family opportunity and the foundation of what became available, I said. He seems to be suggesting that because some of the family's assets, specifically the house and investment accounts, went to other family members rather than being available to me, I was disadvantaged in a way that he feels some responsibility for. And he may be positioning that as a basis for some claim on what I've built. Renata was quiet. There's another possibility, I said. He might simply want to invest, to come in as a partner because he can see it's working. And would that be acceptable to you? She said. No, I said, not at this point. Not without understanding exactly what he's asking for and why. She nodded. Let me tell you what I'm looking for, she said. Are there any structures in the way your father's estate was set up that could generate a legal claim on assets you've built independently? In most states, the answer to that is clearly no. You inherited the property free and clear of family obligations. You built the value through your own investment and labor, and the subsequent equity belongs entirely to you. She paused. But people make claims that aren't legally grounded all the time, especially when the amounts involved make a fight feel worthwhile. What do you recommend? I said. Get everything documented, she said. Every conversation, every meeting. Get your corporate structure reviewed so that it's airtight and clearly established your individual ownership. And don't agree to anything. Not a meeting, not a meal, not a handshake, without telling me first. I followed her advice to the letter. The dinner where everything came to the surface happened 3 months after my first meeting with Renata. Raymond had organized it. Framed it as a family financial planning discussion. He said, been thinking about legacy planning. About how the family's various financial interests could be structured to benefit everyone going forward. He had brought in, he mentioned casually, his own attorney and financial advisor. I brought Renata. He had not expected that. When I walked into the restaurant with Renata beside me, composed, professional, carrying a document case, Raymond's expression shifted through several things in about 2 seconds. He recovered quickly, as people who spend their lives in boardrooms learn to do. I wasn't aware we were bringing counsel, he said. I like to be prepared, I said. You know that about me. We sat down. The table was larger than expected. Raymond, Sandra, Deb, Carol, their attorney, a man named Briggs, who had the sleek quality of expensive representation, their financial advisor, and Tyler, which surprised me slightly. Megan was not there. Raymond led with warmth. He always led with warmth. It was a technique, not a lie, and I had watched it long enough to know the difference. He talked about legacy, about the Hargrove name, about how his own work and my father's sacrifices had contributed to building a foundation from which the next generation could grow. He talked about the family's history of working together, the collaboration that had produced the house, the investment accounts, the various ventures. He talked about how extraordinary it was what I had built. And then he talked about how it seemed natural, given all of this, that the family should be involved in what was coming next. I let him talk. When he finished, the table was quiet. Everyone was looking at me, That was beautifully said, I told him. Can I ask you to be specific? A beat. What specifically are you asking for? I said. Raymond looked at Briggs briefly. We're proposing a family partnership structure, Briggs said. Recognizing that the development of 1147 Industrial Drive was made possible in part by the inheritance from Gerald Hargrove's estate. The property assessed at $212,000, I said, with $41,000 in outstanding liabilities. The net inheritance value was effectively $171,000 in an unimproved asset. Correct, Briggs said. And the subsequent development was funded entirely through my own capital, my own labor, a construction loan I secured independently, and proceeds from equipment sales I managed, I said. None of that originated from the family. The foundation was a building full of rust that my father's family was glad to see go to me, rather than require any of them to deal with, I said. Let's be honest about what the inheritance was. The table was very quiet. Raymond's expression was doing something careful. We're not questioning your work, he said. We're recognizing the starting point. The starting point, I said, was $42 and a building with 3 municipal compliance notices. I have documentation of everything from that point forward. Every dollar invested, every dollar earned, every decision made. I paused. What are the specific terms you're proposing? Briggs laid it out. They were proposing a family partnership structure in which Hargrove Development would be restructured to include a family trust, to be composed of Raymond, Deb, Carol, and their respective estates, as a 30% equity partner, in recognition of what they termed foundational family. Investment in Gerald Hargrove's assets. 30%. Of everything I had built, for a building full of rust that they had been glad to hand off at a will reading. I looked at the table for a moment. Then I looked at Raymond. Let me make sure I understand, I said. You're proposing that because my father left me an asset that you and your siblings had no interest in, and that I converted from a liability into something valuable through 9 years of independent work and investment, you're entitled to 30% of the result. It's a recognition of... What did any of you contribute? I said. After the will reading. What did you invest? What did you build? What did you risk? Silence. Not the house, I said. That went to Raymond. Not the investment accounts. Not the vehicles or the jewelry or the vacation property. Those all went where they went. And I said nothing. And I accepted it. I paused. I accepted a building full of rust and I turned it into something. Alone. And now that it's something, you'd like 30%. Raymond's jaw tightened. Lucas, he said. The family was present at a will reading 9 years ago, I said. And I want to be honest about what was in the room that day. I looked at him directly. Tyler almost laughed. You told me it was a hard break. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody offered help. Nobody suggested that the distribution was anything but final. I paused. Because it was. And I accepted it. Carol looked at her hands. Deb was looking at Briggs. What I built is mine, I said. Legally. Completely. Renata has reviewed every element of the corporate structure and every document in the development history. There is no legal basis for the claim you're making. There is no foundation investment that creates a claim on Hargrove Development. I paused. And even if there were, the proportionality would be absurd. An unimproved asset worth $200,000 does not entitle a 30% share of a portfolio worth substantially more than that. We're not here to fight, Raymond said. His voice had changed. The warmth was still present, but there was something underneath it now. Something harder. Good, I said. Then we agree there's nothing to fight about. Lucas, he leaned forward slightly. I want you to think about what you're doing. This is your family. I know it is, I said. I've been thinking about that for 9 years. Raymond looked at me for a long moment. Your father would have wanted. My father, I said, and I said it carefully, with the specific clarity of someone who has thought about this for a very long time, left me a building full of rust and $42. I loved him. I still do. But whatever he would have wanted is not a claim on what I built after he was gone. The table was completely still. Renata, beside me, said nothing. She didn't need to. She had prepared me for every scenario, and this was going exactly as we had discussed. "I'm going to make you an offer," I said, "and I want to be clear that this is not a negotiation starting point. This is the offer." Everyone at the table was looking at me. "My company is doing well," I said. "We have a development pipeline that is going to require capital partners over the next 3 years. I am willing to offer any family member the opportunity to invest as a limited partner, with clear, market rate terms, no preferential structure, no governance rights, just a return on capital invested." I paused. "Any family member who wants to participate in what I'm building can participate as an investor, at fair terms, not as an owner." Raymond said, That's what I'm offering," I said. "Take it or leave it. But I need you to understand something clearly." I looked around the table. At Raymond, at Deb, at Carol, at Tyler, at the lawyers. "I have documentation of every conversation we've had since you called me in January. I have Renata's review of the complete legal structure. If a claim is pursued through any channel, I am completely prepared to defend what I've built." I paused. "I would prefer not to spend money defending it. I would prefer to spend money building it. That's still the choice I'm making every day." Raymond sat back. He was quiet for a long time. It was Carol who spoke first. "I'm sorry," she said. Everyone looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said again. She was looking at me, not at the others. "When Gerald died, when the will was read, I knew it wasn't right. The way things were divided. I knew it wasn't right, and I didn't say anything." She shook her head. "I'm sorry for that." I looked at my aunt. She had a catering business she had built herself. From nothing, and I had always known that somewhere. "Thank you for saying that, Carol," I said. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I want you to know that. I came here because Raymond asked me to, and I shouldn't have. This isn't right." She pushed her chair back and stood up. She looked at Raymond. "This is not right," she said. "And if you pursue it, you do it without me." She left the table. Tyler watched her go. Then he looked at me, and something moved in his face that was the closest thing to genuine I had seen from him. "I still shouldn't have laughed," he said. "At the will reading. I've thought about that." I looked at my cousin. "I know," I said. The dinner ended, not with drama, not with threats or legal filings or stormed-out accusations. With people gathering their things and moving toward the door in the specific silence of a room where something has been said that can't be unsaid. Briggs said something to Raymond in a low voice as they left. Raymond paused at the edge of the table. He looked at me. Something in his expression was different from everything I had seen in the past 9 years. Different from the pity at the will reading. Different from the warmth performance at the dinner he'd hosted. Different from the careful framing of the last 3 months. "You built something real," he said. "Yes," I said. "Your father couldn't do it," he said. "I know," I said. "How?" he said. One word. Genuinely asked. I thought about the composition notebooks, the public library and the YouTube lectures, the cold emails to Desmond Park, the evenings alone in the warehouse with a rust remover and a headlamp, the construction loan that took 4 iterations. I stopped trying to look like I was building something, I said, and I just built it. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the efficient nod of a practical man acknowledging something he respects. And he left. Renata and I sat at the table for a few minutes after everyone was gone. She allowed herself for the first time in the entire evening a small expression that was not professional neutrality. "You were prepared," she said. "I've had 9 years of preparation," I said. "What happens now?" she said. "Raymond doesn't pursue it," I said. "He's too smart. He did the cost-benefit analysis at that table in real time, and he knows the math doesn't work in his favor." I paused. Deb follows Raymond's lead. Tyler makes peace with himself about what he did and didn't do. "And Carol?" she said. I thought about Carol pushing her chair back. "Carol gets a call from me next week," I said. "Not about business, just a call." Renata nodded. "And you?" she said. I looked around the restaurant. Ordinary Tuesday night. People eating, talking, carrying their ordinary lives. I have a development I'm closing next month, I said. 14-unit mixed use in a pre-transition zone. I've been working on it for 8 months. I stood up. I'm going to go home and look at the plans. She laughed. Good, she said. I called Carol the following Tuesday. She answered immediately. There was something in her voice when she heard mine. Relief, maybe, or the specific gratitude of someone who was afraid the phone wouldn't ring. We talked for an hour. She told me things I hadn't known. About the years after my grandfather died, when the family dynamics had taken the shape they held ever since. About my father and Raymond, and the competition between them that was never spoken and always present. About how the will had been structured in ways that reflected old arrangements and old debts that she had understood better than I had at 24. He wasn't a bad person, she said. About Raymond, he's just someone who has always known the value of things and not always known the value of people. I know, I said. What you've built, she said. It's extraordinary, Lucas. I need you to know I believe that. From nothing. Not from nothing, I said. From rust. She was quiet for a moment. From rust, she said. That's better. We had lunch the following month. No business conversation. Just catching up in the way of family members who realize, sometimes late, that they have more in common than the family structure had made room for. Megan reached out shortly after. She had not been at the dinner, and when I asked, she said she had heard what Raymond was planning and had told him she wouldn't come. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. She was, I discovered in the conversations that followed, someone who had spent 30 years in her family seeing things clearly and choosing her moments carefully. She asked about the development work, not as a prelude to asking for something, just because she was genuinely curious. I told her. She asked good questions. We kept talking. I want to tell you where I am now. Hargrove Development currently operates a portfolio of 14 properties. The assessed value of the portfolio is substantially more than I will say here because the number, stated cold, sounds like bragging, and this story is not about the number. The story is about the rust. The story is about the $42. The story is about the composition notebooks and the cold emails and the evenings alone in an enormous abandoned building with a headlamp and a question I kept answering the same way. What do I do next? Desmond Park attended the opening of my 6th development. He stood in the renovated atrium of what had been a completely derelict commercial building, and he looked at the tenant base. Small businesses, creative studios, a community health clinic on the ground floor. And he said, in the understated way of Desmond, this is what it's supposed to look like. My mother was at the 7th opening. She walked through every space. She touched the walls, the light fixtures, the window frames. She had the specific quality of someone processing the difference between what had been and what was. She found me at the end of the tour. Your father would have been proud, she said. I thought about this differently than when Raymond had said it. Because my mother knew both things. What my father was and what he had hoped for. She knew the performance and the private quiet. She knew the potential that had never quite arrived. I know, I said. I think he would have. She took my face in her hands, my mother, who had sat beside me at a conference table while a lawyer read a deed for a building full of rust, and held my hand, and she looked at me the way she always had. Like I was worth the trouble. Like I had always been worth it. He wasn't wrong to hope, she said. He was just hoping about the wrong person. Here is the thing I have thought about the most, in the years since the dinner where Raymond came back with his attorney and his proposal. He was right about one thing. The foundation mattered, not in the way he meant it, not as a claim on what I had built, but as the truth about what starting from nothing actually looks like. I did not start from nothing. I started from rust. And rust is not nothing. Rust is the evidence that something was once there, that someone once tried, that the capacity existed even if the execution failed. My father was the rust, not because he was a failure, that is too simple and too unkind. He was a man whose ambition outran his discipline, whose performance obscured his potential, whose inability to look clearly at what things actually required meant that he spent his life adjacent to success without arriving there. He left me the building, not as an inheritance in any meaningful financial sense, as a problem. And I have come to believe, in the way you come to believe things that have been tested over years, that problems handed to you by the people you love are sometimes the most important things they could have given you. Not because the problem is a gift wrapped in difficulty, because the problem reveals what you're made of. You don't know what you can build until you're standing in a building full of rust with $42 and no one waiting to help you. You find out that you can read compliance notices and sell industrial lathes to film production companies and write cold emails and show up at 9 a.m. with a printed and bound presentation and hold for 5 years when the margin says to sell and document everything and sit at a dinner table with your family's attorney across from you and not flinch. You find out you can do all of it because there's no one else. That is the inheritance, not the rust. The knowledge that you are the only one who is going to do this, and that it is enough. My name is Lucas Hargrove. My father left me ruins, and I built something, not to prove anything to anyone who doubted me, not to show my family what they missed, or make my uncle regret what he walked away with. I built it because the building existed and the rust was real and someone had to decide what to do with it. I decided. Every day. For 9 years, I decided. And when the people who hadn't decided, who had taken their portions and considered their obligations complete, came back to tell me that my decision was partly theirs, I was ready. Because I had been preparing for that conversation since the moment I stood in an empty warehouse with a headlamp and understood, in the cold and the quiet of an enormous abandoned space, that there was no version of this story where someone else did the work. There was only me. There was always only me. And me turned out to be enough, more than enough. If you are standing in your own warehouse right now, if someone has handed you the building no one wanted, the problem no one claimed, the $42 and the deed with 3 compliance notices, I need you to hear this. The fact that they didn't want it does not mean it has no value. The value is not in what it is. The value is in what you are willing to do with it. Start with the compliance notices. Start with the rust. Start with whatever you have. And build. Because the people who build from nothing become something that cannot be taken. They tried to take it. I was ready. You be ready too.